Hi, my name is Jehan Roberson, and I am a second-year Ph.D. student in the Department of Literatures and English at Cornell University. Before I begin my talk, I would like to first offer my sincerest thanks to Professor Derek Spires for recommending me for this series, as well as for his ongoing support for me and my work. I would also like to say thank you to Susan Zender and Rachel Dworkin, the education director and the archivist, respectively, for the Chemung Historical Society. Their help has been invaluable in thinking through the lives and textual acts of John W. Jones, especially. Finally, I would also like to say thank you to Professor Gerard Aching for his support of my work and for our ongoing collaboration on Cornell's Voices of the Underground Railroad project. In turning to my talk, I would like to invite you all to think alongside me. These concepts are very much in progress and continuously evolving, as is my research. So thank you in advance for being in dialogue with me and my work. Freedom Seeking as Land Literacy, John W. Jones, Jermaine Logan, and the Underground Railroad. For those of us who are Black and who practice memory work, who journey into Black archives seeking whatever fragments of our history we might stitch together, in many ways, we are channeling that particularly diasporic sense of loss into searches for the intangible, for a historically impossible sense of wholeness. Memory work enables us to search for that sense of recognition that comes from finding a trace, an echo across time and space that harkens to a past from which we have been intentionally distanced. Memory work is a constant grappling with what Jennifer L. Morgan deems, quote, a scholarly induced malady, known well to those who work on the subaltern, on people and places that are understood as outside of or marginal to the archival project of nation building, end quote. Morgan continues that this malady is, quote, a relationship to research that positions us always on the brink of breakthrough and breakdown, end quote. Far more often than not, historical archives only tell a story in fragments, in unfinished pieces. We then attempt to suture together those pieces in the hopes of uncovering a bit more of the past and the lessons contained within the legacy of Black survival. What often gets lost, though, are the technologies that Black people have developed across time and space in order to both affirm and shield their humanity from the constant threat and the everyday reality of white violence. Enough is known about daily acts of resistance to recognize that they were typically covert, thereby requiring us to see what isn't written or preserved in the archive. Where white enslavers saw obstinance, laziness, and disobedience, a knowing eye is able to read tiny rebellions of refusal against one's enslavement and forced labor. As evidenced by the Underground Railroad, where removing most traces of freedom seekers became a key tactic for the movement's endurance and success, some absences are intentional. Some may not even be absences at all, but rather obfuscations, truths hidden in plain sight that might become accessible to us through developing new modes of interpretation, new forms of reading these encrypted messages. This need for new literacy methods becomes apparent in the works of two prominent regional figures, John W. Jones and Reverend Jermaine Logan. A prominent figure during his lifetime and in the century plus since his passing, John W. Jones escaped plantation slavery in Virginia and journeyed north to central New York, Elmira more specifically, where he eventually settled. Yet it wasn't enough for Jones to have achieved freedom for himself. He became one of the foremost conductors on the Underground Railroad nationwide, assisting in achieving freedom for more than 800 people. And while Jones's abolitionist efforts are a celebrated part of his legacy, perhaps an even bigger claim to fame for Jones was the care he showed in his role as sexton for the Confederate prison camp in Elmira. I too was struck by Jones's generosity, but equally striking was the emphasis placed on Jones's act of care, with many contemporaneous reporters opining on the magnanimity of spirit and the remarkable strength of character he displayed through his meticulous record keeping, and intending so thoughtfully to the memorializing of those who fought for the denial of his own humanity and his right to self-govern. As stated on the website Mark Twain Studies, quote, "The story of Jones's work, burying the Confederate dead, can be told and interpreted in many ways. One version of the story emphasizes the immense compassion and care that must have been required for Jones, the self-emancipated, formerly enslaved Black man, to bury with such diligence the bodies of Southern white men who were fighting a war to preserve slavery. This is the story that is preserved on a memorial erected in Woodlawn National Cemetery in 1997. The memorial reads, between July 1864 and August 1865, 2,973 Confederate soldiers were buried here, with kindness and respect by John W. Jones, a runaway slave. They have remained in these hallowed grounds of Woodlawn National Cemetery by family choice because of the honorable way in which they were laid to rest by a caring man." End quote. Jones's work in the Confederate prison camp, particularly considering his status as a formerly enslaved person, arguably became his claim to fame, nearly overshadowing his acts of self and communal liberation. Yet I want to think a bit differently about Jones and his Book of the Dead, which is the name he gave to the ledger of names he kept of each of the dead Confederates. Jones's Book of the Dead was turned over to the National Archives at the turn of the 20th century, although it's unclear where the book is now, or if its status or even its existence is known. An archival fragment that perhaps seems inconsequential, Jones's ledger, his Book of the Dead, encapsulates the deep tension at the intersection of Blackness and archives. This tension is, I argue, best laid out by scholar Saidiya Hartman in her groundbreaking essay, Venus in Two Acts. In this essay, Hartman offers an account of two girls whose lives and existence is only verifiable, only traceable through the ledgers, legal records, captain's logs, ship manifests, and surgeon's journals. One girl, unnamed, the other known only as, quote, Venus. It must be noted that their deaths, not their lives, are the subjects of such record keeping, and the difficulty of reconstructing the story of their lives is only further compounded by this lack. Hartman states, quote, "The archive is, in this case, a death sentence, tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life. To be sure, most antebellum records of Black people are culled from those same ship ledgers, bills of sale, posters advertising, quote, runaway slaves, and the like. Thus, for Jones to both eschew the popular slave narrative genre and to nonetheless cement himself within historical records as a steward on multiple fronts is to turn the colonial archive on its head. Moreover, as a steward for freedom seekers as well as for the dead and dying Confederates, Jones cites his stewardship within his knowledge of and relationship to the land. Jones's work then becomes a form of land literacy, a way of relating to and engaging with the land that is rooted in Blackness and in Black methods of knowledge production. In a related fashion, Jermaine Logan found his way to central New York, journeying from the outskirts of Nashville to Syracuse and then to Canada before returning to Syracuse and establishing himself not only as a prominent conductor, but as the third pastor of St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church in Ithaca, a major stop on the Underground Railroad in this region, and a noted abolitionist site that hosted Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and many others known figures in the ongoing movement for Black lives. After achieving freedom for himself in Canada, Logue returned to central New York and settled in Syracuse, then changing his name to Logan from Logue and becoming a well-documented abolitionist, someone who regularly published his activities in the local papers, detailing his role in ferrying souls across the Canadian border and publicly declaring his house and his church as havens. Logan also wrote an autobiography that does fall into the genre of slave narrative. However, the writing I'd like to focus on is a response to his former enslaver's request that he pay her more than $1,000 for the loss of the horse he rode to the north and for the loss of his labor. This letter was written in 1860, and in today's dollars, that would be a little over $34,000 that she's requesting. In his response to Sarah Logue, dated March 28, 1860, Jermaine Logan writes, quote, "But you say I am a thief because I took the old mare along with me. Have you got to learn that I had a better right to the old mare, as you call her, than Manasseh Logue, Sarah Logue's deceased husband, had to me? If he and you infer that I forfeit all my rights to you, shall not I infer that you forfeit all your rights to me? Have you got to learn that human rights are mutual and reciprocal? And if you take my liberty and life, you forfeit your own liberty and life. I will not budge one hair's breadth. I will not breathe a shorter breath, even to save me from your persecutions. I stand among a free people who, I thank God, sympathize with my rights and the rights of mankind. And if your emissaries and vendors come here to re enslave me and escape the unshrinking vigor of my own right arm, I trust my strong and brave friends in this city and state will be my rescuers and avengers." End quote. Within these lines, Logan boldly challenges a white woman, and this is nearly 100 years before 14-year-old Emmett Till loses his wife for whistling at a white woman, a claim she eventually confesses to making up. Thus, the audacious nature of the letter in 1860 cannot be overstated. But beyond challenging his former enslaver, Logan goes on to lay out his understanding of reciprocity as inextricably linked to our relationships with one another and with land. Logan maps himself as not only in the North, but of the North, and in adamantly telling Sarah Logue that any conflict around his freedom would have to happen on his terms, or on his turf, so to speak. Logan enacts a radical gesture of land literacy, cementing his self-liberation on the Underground Railroad as an act of resistance, one that he continues through his stewardship. Furthermore, as evidenced by his emphasis on reciprocity, he evinces a fundamental understanding of stewardship and alerts his former enslaver to this fact by pointing to the community he has stewarded and how they will, in turn, provide for him. That Logan's radicality is based on an ethics of care further underscores how stewardship is rooted in Black liberatory practices. The Underground Railroad, as a liberatory practice, is one of many Black geographic engagements. Indeed, it is this movement of Black people through various unknown geographies and terrains that suggests to me that there is a deeper intimacy undergirding Black land relationships, one predicated on intermittent disclosure, on recognizing and developing the land's symbolisms and codes, all operating as techniques of land literacy. In thinking about traditional geography, what we know to be derived from white, male, European, colonial, heterosexist thought, we see that traditional geography is maintained by a corresponding vocabulary, insides and outsides, borders and belongings, in place and out of place, and so on. This recognition, however, makes clear that geographies of resistance are able to undo traditional geography through acts of respatialization, such as ship coups, the Underground Railroad, hush harbors, and more. For both men, as evidenced by their given professions of sexton and pastor, and also as conductors on the Underground Railroad, stewardship becomes the means through which they sustain their land literacy practices. While their work as conductors is more than proof positive of their commitment to stewarding others through unknown terrains to freedom, their textual acts create registers of their resistance, documentation that recognizes the colonial emphasis on the tangible, while also speaking to Black readers across time and space and in ways that say, "I was here," in ways that contradict the popular tropes of Black people as passive, docile, and in need of white saviors. What's more, and contradictory to colonial or traditional archival practices that seek to render the archive as objective, record keeping and cataloging and other similar practices go unnamed and thus unclaimed. For Jones and Logan, however, they ensured their works were clearly documented as emanating from them. For both Jones and Logan, then, the turn to the text is as subversive as it is cartographic, an intentional gesture that registers their acts of resistance across geographies. In addition to their deep involvement in the Underground Railroad, both men used their lived experiences to guide other freedom seekers away from the horrors of slavery. And while there was certainly a good deal of stealth involved in their work, both recognized the power of the text as a way of fighting historical erasure and as a means of fighting misreadings of their deeds. Moreover, both men's writings serve to respatialize Blackness outside of the tropes that continue to inform popular understandings of Black people and Black being. For John W. Jones, I contend that his Book of the Dead was not meant to be solely a ledger of names. Rather, Jones displayed a deep understanding of the power inherent in record keeping, in memory work. As a steward for hundreds of freedom seekers, as well as for the nearly 3,000 dead Confederates, Jones ensured that his own subjectivity was permanently inscribed. In Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle, Catherine McKittrick writes, quote, in discussing written and oral histories, Edouard Glissant remarks that the relationship between the writer or speaker and the landscape, in fact, makes history and brings the subject into being. In a way, Glissant reconciles the Black subject to geography, arguing that expressive acts, particularly the naming of place, regardless of expressive method and technique, is also a process of self-assertion and humanization, a naming of inevitable Black geographic presence. To put it another way, naming place is also an act of naming the self and self-histories. End quote. I'm struck by how this leads McKittrick to term the unfinished nature of this project as a poetics of questioning. This is central, I believe, to understanding both John W. Jones and Reverend Jermaine Logan's sustained engagement with space as part of an ongoing process of rethinking, remapping, and renaming. McKittrick refers to geography as where we know from, and through both men's writings as resistance, they articulate their deep, overlapping knowledges of the terrains through which they journeyed and through which they stewarded others. Moreover, they articulate themselves, establishing their humanity on their own terms, outside of the tropes of Black people as dispossessed, as lacking, as always out of place. By rationalizing the colonization, kidnapping, and transport of Black people through objectification and monetizing them as non-human labor, white enslavers create a geography that is both naturalized and seen as the very site of social progression. The fact that enslaved people were stolen away and hidden in the bowels of ships is purposeful and illustrative of how space and place work to enclose Black people, both materially and ideologically. Blackness, then, is both a defining characteristic of space and always in need of being kept, quote, in place. While Jones's stewardship of the Confederate prison camp was deemed noteworthy because of a presumed superhuman empathy, the notoriety and his rise to the status of local public figure meant that more light was shined on his other efforts, specifically his ongoing abolitionist deeds. This notoriety extended to his role within the Underground Railroad in central New York in such a way that Elmira's significance as the primary stop between Philadelphia and Canada became well-known antebellum history. In the mid-19th century United States, the genre of the slave narrative quickly came to be defined by an emphasis on sentimentality and struggle, reinforcing the idea of Black people as forever synonymous with slavery and as objects, a continuous denial of their subjectivity through portraits of Blackness as models of strength in the midst of adversity. The slave narrative emerged at a time when the young nation was writing its own self-aggrandizing history, when American sentimentalism was at an all-time high, and when white abolitionists, primarily located in the North, sought to maintain white political and moral authority. Among even the most famous narratives of Frederick Douglass, Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and others is a profound awareness of audience. In many ways, their narratives exist as book-length persuasive essays written for a white readership to convince them of both Black humanity and virtuousness, as well as the evils of slavery. What may register as discomfort in our present day readings is arguably the slave narrative's hallmark, the reinscription of the author's greatest traumas, the most extreme instances of violence they witnessed and experienced while enslaved. The violence travels from their physical and spiritual experiences to the violence embedded within the written word. And although Logan did author an autobiography much in line with this genre, I believe it's important that his response to his mistress' query is arguably his better known text. Land literacy as a practice, then, is a sustained and intimate engagement with land, not based on extractivist and harmful practices, but rather based on an ethic of care and reciprocity. To navigate the unknown landscapes of the metaphorical railroad, both Jones and Logan had to lean into and cultivate knowledge of the plants, animals, rivers, streams, trodden and untrodden paths, and more in order to successfully steal themselves away. Consider too that for Black people in the 19th century, especially for the enslaved and formerly enslaved, textual practices were inherently political. Literacy was almost always withheld because enslavers recognized the power of text to liberate, both literally and figuratively. Their literacy of the land is further evidence then in how Jones and Logan reject notions of Blackness as always out of place. Through their texts, we can see that both men established themselves as belonging to the lands in which they found their freedom. As sexton, John W. Jones established himself as a caretaker of human and ecological life, in clear recognition of the relationship between the two and the need for reciprocity. Logan is even more explicit, challenging Mrs. Logue to come north and retrieve him, and thereby marking himself as both a fully autonomous human being and one who has sited himself squarely within his central New York community. Stewardship, in turn, hinges on these same themes of trust and reciprocity. My readings of Jones and Logan are largely informed by my own work on Cornell's Voices on the Underground Railroad project, where I wrote a narrative from the perspective of a freedom seeker. Through that writing, I came to understand stewardship as wholly dependent on this sense of responsibility, first and foremost to those whose knowledge is being transmitted. The archive not only holds knowledge, but also organizes it, and thus organizes our understandings of what we find and what we come to know, and how we come to know. Rather than let their own lives be narrated by others, both Jones and Logan assured that their stories would not fall prey to the violent, fictitious histories wrought by colonization and its logics of killing, erasing, and misreading Blackness. As I deepen my own interrogation of Black geographies of freedom, the lesson of stewardship is one that I continue to grapple with as I work to read texts, broadly construed as that from which we derive meaning, across traditional archives and landscapes and other sites that hold Black memory. My belief is that land literacy opens up deeper understandings of Blackness and of how Black people have mapped themselves into collective memory. Moreover, the emphasis on praxis harkens to the responsibility we all bear as we consider the need for reciprocity and being in right relationship with land and with its archival memory across space and time. Thank you.